bride with fire. His bride is about to come forth purified and clothed in fire. The bride clothed in fire. She came through what Moses and the, I don't know how to say that, Shumarite had come through. God owns her, and he clothes her with his very own fire. It's a fire that terrifies the enemy and brings him to his knees. It's a fire that can ignite the very heavens for God. The very heavens for God's plans and purposes. She is clothed in the very fire of God. The fire manifests itself in love, compassion, authority, and power. All the world will see that the bride is in love, and they will fear it because she has become the flame of the Lord. You must let go of everything that hinders God's possession in you. He's proceeding towards something so glorious. He's going to bring his bride to himself and into union with him. He's going to make her a glorious flame across the earth. If we want to be part of that, the world cannot stay within us. We must become people of noble character. We cannot be weak and beggarly. Our faith must be strong and noble. We cannot be people who love the truth when we hear it and then turn our face. Forget the truth and live the lie. We cannot be people who want the kingdom with one hand, but reach out for the things of the world with the other hand. That is not the bride. That is the harlot. The bride will speak in purity and will love in purity. She will cleanse herself of all things that offend for the sake of her divine husband. The harlot will have a continued love affair with the world, even while she says with her mouth, I love you, Lord. The Bible clearly says that he will turn to that so-called virgin and say, Begone, I know you not. The harlot will not come into the chambers of God, but the bride will. There she will find the flame of divine love that will capture her, purify her, and empower her for his glory.
That is powerful. That needs to go on our site. That needs to go on our site. Did you write that?
No, I did not write that.
That is just...
It was Anita Johnson.
Nita Johnson. Awesome.
Paul's husband comes out of Psalms 34:19. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. And that afflictions is just really what it is. It's that adversity, whatever that form that adversity is. It shows itself in many different ways, but no matter what that is, the Lord will deliver out of that all. So it's again, it's that place of where you're dedicating yourself in the midst of it.
And through that affliction is how you get that close to God, to get that flame of God.
Because what we're talking about is what I've just been posting on my Facebook stuff. So here I am just cruising along, and I went to look up something in my Thompson chain, and just like Kai's been talking about, when the Lord just quickens your eyes down to a certain place on the page in your Bible or whatever, whether it's a verse or a word. And that day, it was Friday, palliation. I didn't even know what it was. I had to look it up. I could kind of tell by the verses, so I'm looking at it. But it's the very rebuke of sin. And all the verses are examples of men of God who are rebuking sin, whether it's in, individual hearts or community, like Ezra had to do as people returned to the land and had to separate them from the sin and the beliefs that they had with the false or the strange women and children that they brought back into the land. Palliation is when the Lord sends a very strong word that just pushes back that false stuff. So I loved how you even started us off today, Charles, with that wonderful thing, this prayer. The 2 dreams I had last week that I told you guys about, the imprecation, just rebuking that stuff that's trying to steal our rest and peace. Whether it comes through a spirit or through an attitude, of individuals or just their viewpoint. So other people's worldview sometimes. You just have to rebuke it from yourself and say, no, that's not coming near me or my house. You look at Paul and Silas, they're in that prison. It did not matter, in a sense to them, their placement by men, because that was not God's attitude toward them. Rest and peace and assurance was their full salvation. And so they rebuked it off by praise and worship. Not as in prayer of imprecation toward the people, but just praise and worship of God. Brought the rebuke. And the rebuke then was a shaking of everything, of everyone, in mindsets and in spirits and in whole placements. Because not only that, the very jailer and himself and their whole household were in a mental prison. So look at how God can rebuke a whole mindset, a whole worldview of things, a whole laws of men that are not of God can be rebuked by this praise and worship, this assurance of rest and peace and salvation through all things and in all kinds of circumstances. And the Lord just walked through that place in their praise. Do you see that? It says, the verse that we were looking at, was that in Philippians? Yes. Philippians 2:12 and 13. Work out salvation in fear and in trembling. Who causes the fear and trembling? It's that holy fear of God, knowing who he is, and the trembling that he causes by the Holy Spirit whenever he comes to men. John the Baptist said, who is it that you come out to see? A reed shaken by the wind? In other words, did you just come out for the spectacle of watching some guy tremble? Because when God's presence is near, a man of God is going to tremble in that fear of the Lord. That great whirlwind of his spirit that moves so mightily through the trees and causes them to let forth a sound that you've never heard before. You know, are you just coming this morning for spectacle, or are you coming because you know in this place there is the fear of the Lord and the trembling of the Lord, and your very life, the things that you want shaken off, the things that you want moved away from you, the old leaves that need to fall away, the thoughts and ideas, the old works that have worked in a past season, but God says now that's not going to work in the new season, but you want that gone from your life. Are you here to let that wind blow through and just shake the whole being? I don't know if you all watched the storm we had this last week. It was powerful. When I posted that picture, it's no ordinary day, and we went into such a wind. All the trees around our property and in our community were just, when they bend from side to side, and you wonder, are they going to stay intact? That's what this looks like. All these men in prison, Nebuchadnezzar even, God was able to blow such a wind through Daniel that it shook him so completely that he's on his hands and knees for 7 years. And I always marvel that Daniel was faithful to all that he saw over Nebuchadnezzar's life, because as the next most powerful man of the whole empire, he never allowed another man to take Nebuchadnezzar's place till God's work was fully done with him. That is a powerful, powerful word, but it's also a powerful man of God, knowing God's not done with the man that he's brought to his knees. Most of us stop there. Wow, God, you humbled them. Boy, they deserve that. But God's not done with that person yet. Are we praying through till we see God either lift them up in exaltation up off of that with a different mindset to praise and worship him, or are we waiting to see that where it was also talked about that they are then fully taken into perdition, where God himself finishes it? Because he knows the full extent of their life, and you and I do not. These are powerful, powerful words. And that's why God sends a holy, righteous man to rebuke some of these key leaders that we see. As a man of God was sent to Eli, and Nathan was sent to David. You can just go on down through that list of different men that were rebuked by the Lord, but yet God's not done with them. And so the rebuke can bring them to a greater strength, just as the tree that Daniel saw about Nebuchadnezzar's life can bring them to a greater strength and a greater understanding of God's whole plan and purpose, and henceforth they can worship and praise. But then the whole kingdom and the whole empire is shifted because of allowing that righteous breath to just blow through, so that the new growth can then come where the old is set aside. Awesome stuff. But it is God's sovereign right again to remove a man to perdition. Most of us are crying out that evil leaders would be removed from us just so our lives would be easy. How many of us are crying out to actually be the ones to bring the words that would rebuke them so something could shift in their life so that others can be set free? So that the whole kingdom, in a sense, the empire, can have its full destiny in God. Just as Nebuchadnezzar's destiny of his nation had its full end, and Daniel was there to see to that full end, and even on for the beginnings of the Medo-Persian Empire. But the truths of that went on throughout history, and that word of Daniel then still a living testimony for all those hundreds of thousands of years that came after in the fullness of that.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention some things about restoration. And, God brings things to a complete end. God brings things to a complete finishing, and it must be, because when God restores, as God brings that finishing, he brings that restoration. And God's restoration, I had done a study on that quite a while ago, a couple months ago, I guess. But he was talking to me about even the restoration of body, soul, and spirit. Being in a time where God will bring in the restoration of body, soul, and spirit. And he used the words also rejuvenate and restitution and all of those things. But I just wanted to give you that definition of what restoring is, and that it is to bring back, return to former state, give back something lost or stolen, return to former condition, place, or position, reestablish, reinstall, bring back to a state of health, soundness, or vigor, and renew. But it even goes beyond that, because the biblical meaning of the word restoration is to receive back more than has been lost, to the point where the final state is greater than the original condition. So the meaning is someone or something is improved beyond measure. See, that's God's restoration. Just doesn't bring you back to where it's God's restoration, because when he brings a complete end to something, and his life, it's his life that comes into that restoration process. God blesses people for their faith and hardships by making up for their losses and giving them more than they had previously had before. But it is also that thing of when God tears down, he also builds up. And I was thinking of the restoration of God that's coming into the earth, and the full redemption of God that's coming into the earth. And what's it going to look like when these systems of the world are torn down? What's going to happen when these systems of the world collapse and God rebuilds and God restores and brings that full redemption that he's always had in mind, bringing back to a former state, but beyond, beyond even what that was, and brings in the eternal. So restoration is that when God brings in the restoration, it is that eternal element of his life and breath that comes back in and gives us more. Now the thing is, it's his life that is in us. It is the image of Christ within us. God has to tear down that which is in us, that is of the world's nature, which is of our flesh, so that his nature would be predominant within us. And so when God restores, then you have that fullness of his redemption in that. And so his life then is able to flow more freely within us. And it's just a good thing when God restores. So because in the end, God is our reward.
I just wanted to kind of go over what the flow's been so far, because so far we haven't tied in our young people, which was a commitment we made just a couple weeks ago. and also our young people, as in young in faith. So this would be my challenge, seeing these are what the flow has been so far that we need to go off in then. We're talking about the joy of the Lord, and when I see the joy of the Lord, I keep coming to the same place. It's holding on to the eternal realm over the temporal realm. You can give that 100 different labels, but it always still comes down to the same thing. Are you holding on to your peace rest? Because the joy comes out of the peace and rest. And I even had it was interesting, I was talking to the same meditator, that it's interesting, we've had some conversations and you can tell when we're in our head, but you can also tell when we're in the place where the Spirit is. And he was speaking about sometimes, you just have to stop. And he had bought this stop sign, so we had the visual. It'd be nice to have the stop sign here for the visual. So picture a stop sign on the road. You're going to have to bring your visual. And he said, I'll even let you have this after I'm done with it, because you need to just tell people to stop. And his point was, you need to find that place of peace and rest, which you can never find till you stop. And even when we talk about the peace and rest and bringing that atmosphere into this place, you can't find that atmosphere even until you stop. And it was kind of interesting because the Lord was pointing. I could feel the breath on what he was saying. I'm going, well, that's quite interesting. And I just didn't say too much, trying to sort out what God was pointing towards. And interesting, because then I went and found a little note I'd written down about a year ago. It says, sometimes the witness of the Spirit doesn't necessarily mean that what the person's saying is that God has witnessed, more than he's just pointing towards something. And so I said, yeah, I kind of see that. And so going off of that, we're also talking about a sovereign act of God. We said it several times this morning. And I thought it was interesting when I talked about the upper room. Many times we've been trying to shift our mindset on this unity in the body and how do we unify, because we've been unifying in the temporal instead of unifying in the eternal. And that's why it never works. We have to be unified in other words, we're in where the Spirit is, and we're in that flow with the Spirit. That's where we got to unify. When we try to do all these temporal things, we're just making a man structure. We all know when God makes his structure, we're all kind of picking up on it all at the same time. It's what happens when we're at Awakening Fires. We don't know how that thing's going to roll. But as God shows each piece and then shows us the piece that we bring, we see the thing that God was building that day versus us trying to, this sounds really good, so I'm going to try to make this go with this. We've just learned that we give whatever we have, and then we got to what? Just lay it in God's hands. Because we know it's another piece, and he's got the next piece, and we don't know how they fit together. And so we've kind of learned that. And even as I'll just get back to where I was. It wasn't so much that they were unison with each other in the Pentecost time, but they were in unison with the Spirit, which allowed, God's intention was to do the Pentecost thing, but he needed them to get in unison. It wasn't something they were going to produce. They had no clue Pentecost was coming. They had no model to go by, and I'm sure there's shadowings in the Old Testament, if, for those teachers that can pull that out. But in all honesty, they were clueless of what was coming. It was a sovereign act of God. If it's a sovereign act of God, what are we talking? That's what's coming for us. We don't know what that looks like. We might have some ideas of what that looks like. But if this is truly a sovereign act of God, which I believe is coming, we really don't know what it is. What did Peggy say? Restoration of God is beyond the former state. Beyond the former state, which means we can't hook it to anything that's already been. But I do really see when you were talking about the great conflict and the dividing out between the peace and rest, and I take that back actually to Hebrews 3 and 4. I still can't get away from those two, it seems. What was the thing that kept them from entering in to the Lord's rest, as it says? It says doubt and unbelief. That was the key things he said. He made it quite clear. So they could not enter in because they had doubt and unbelief. They would not enter into that full trust of the Lord. And that's really what we're all going to have to, we've got to get into that place of full trust of the Lord, whatever that looks like different in our lives. I don't know what God's dealing with each one of you with, but there's something. in that realm that he's dealing with you.
That kind of ties into what I was reading this morning in Luke when it talked about God said, or Jesus said, let's go over to the other side. And so they're in between the two shores. They're out in the middle. They're not on this side or they're not out on that side. And then the storm hit. And then at that point in time, fear came upon them, and they woke him up out of his rest to voice their fears. And then all he did was just rebuke it. And then they went over to the other side. And then they had the man who had the legion that was delivered over there on the other side. But it's in that middle place. You're not here and you're not there. You're in that middle place where you've got all that stuff.
So I would put out there that not only us, or not only Paducah is in that dealing, but we're all in that dealing. I believe that dealing will probably be settled at Awakening Fires because we always follow that format. So there's actually a whole thing that you're going to see in the background too. And whatever that looks like in your life. Some of us are a little more used to that pattern, but something will rear its face is a good way to put it. And there will be some sorting and decisions, again, that will have to be made in this season. And just be aware of that. We're on Awakening Fires is what weekend? It's the 7th or 14th? 15th? 13th. Okay. So there you got your timeline. I've talked about that enough times. So just kind of watch and see what God's revealing in your life and what he's doing corporately, because it'll follow that pattern. But that's what we're saying. I don't know how we're going to shift into those young guys, but we got to keep that in the back of our head.
It's here today, yeah. I sensed that this morning too, that the flow for the children wasn't going to be at the very beginning. It's going to be in what we're doing. But I do think it's interesting because, in a sense, Charles, this is not a belittling thing. This is just an exhortation that you are so in the flow just because you've stepped in. And the thing that you released in your dream is what's releasing all of this. But it is this truth, and that is God is revealing to us, he's going to reveal to us corporately the face of this thing. So we can all see it, so we all know it. It is a singular fear that is trying to stop us from entering in fully. And it is trying to perpetuate doubt and unbelief. And God wants us to take out this singular fear that is opposing the holy fear that's going to cause the trembling. And it's going to release such a prophetic flow out when we hit that point of that conflict where we actually step past this old fear, and we're going to step into this restoration of the fear of the Lord that has always been meant to be, because it's part of the ancient ways of God. And so for that to come, because there's just been too many dreams and words leading up to this. Like I said, it was a sub-theme of the whole meeting in Kentucky, and it's what's been causing this slavery, whether it comes out of Egypt or any of these other empire-type dynasties that God's been talking about. And so this great conflict is building, and he's just getting more and more people on page with it. So, pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. And it's going to be a mighty conflict, just like what Marty's talking about. It is going to be a big storm. It's going to be huge, just like the wind that we saw blowing through the trees and the thunder and the lightning that came. And, there was hail in that storm also here in Fairfield. I don't know about the rest of you, but there was hail here too. And that hail is representative of the Lord's hard words coming and just really pounding us. Because it needs to. That's just the way of it. So, let that storm come violently within you, just like it did for the jailer and his family. Let that come so it can have its full work so that your whole house can be saved. And I want you to think, it's not just your physical children. It is all of the spiritual children that you're going to have after this point. So you're warring for them. so that they can be set free. And that, that's why we go rushing into this. We're not afraid of this conflict, like the war horse that's talked about in Proverbs 39. You go rushing into it because you say, yes, God, ha, you and your horses and chariots are here. You're bringing this on. You want this to come. This is the day that you have established for this particular battle in this whole long war of spiritual warfare. And we are excited that this day has come for this battle so that the fear of the Lord can really enter into men's hearts in Iowa and Kentucky. Hallelujah.